Racist cop kicks pregnant black woman on sidewalk. He had no idea who was watching. On an ordinary sidewalk under the bright afternoon sky, Sarah Johnson, a pregnant woman, walked home, unaware of the storm about to unfold. The air was thick with the usual city sounds, horns honking, people chatting, and the distant hum of life, but everything shifted when Officer Thompson, his badge gleaming in the sun, approached her with cold authority. "You look suspicious," he snapped, his hand hovering near his gun. Sarah, startled, instinctively placed a hand on her swollen belly, feeling the baby kick, as though sensing the tension in the air. "I'm just trying to get home," she replied, her voice calm yet steady. But Thompson wasn't having it. He stepped closer, his tone sharp. "Don't get smart with me." Without warning, he shoved her against the cold concrete. And then, as the world held its breath, he kicked her in the stomach. The bystanders froze, some too shocked to move, others pulling out their phones. But no one intervened. The cruelty of the moment hung in the air like a dark cloud. Sarah, defenseless, lay there while Officer Thompson turned his back, unfazed. James Johnson was just a few blocks away, lost in his thoughts as he prepared to surprise his wife. Sarah, with her favorite meal, chicken and dumplings, just like her mother used to make. He smiled to himself, imagining Sarah's tired but grateful expression as she leaned back in her chair, savoring the dish. But that smile quickly vanished when his phone buzzed. The frantic voice on the other end was barely coherent, but the message was clear. Something had happened to Sarah. His heart raced as he sprinted out the door, his mind a whirlwind of dread. When he arrived at the hospital, the sterile scent of antiseptic hit him like a wave. He rushed to the room, his legs almost moving faster than his thoughts. And there she was, Sarah, pale, bruised, lying in the bed, but still breathing. Her lip was split, her face swollen, but it was the rise and fall of her belly that took his breath away. The baby was still alive. Relief surged through him, but it was fleeting. The doctor's words barely registered as James stared at the dark bruise blooming on Sarah's stomach. His wife, always the pillar of strength, the woman who had filled their home with laughter and love, was now shattered, and James wasn't going to let that slide. The fight for justice was just beginning. The world outside seemed to move in slow motion as James stood in the sterile hospital hallway, his mind racing. The video of the attack had gone viral, spreading like wildfire across social media. Thousands had seen it, millions had felt the impact of the brutal kick. But James wasn't waiting for justice to come to him, he was going to make it happen. He needed a plan, precision, and someone who understood the system from the inside. His fingers dialed the number of David Cooper, an old friend and civil rights attorney. "No, I'm not okay," James said, his voice steady but heavy with resolve. He gave David the short version: Sarah, the officer, the brutal attack, the video, and the silence from the department. It was a call for action. And David immediately understood. James wasn't just fighting for Sarah anymore, he was fighting for something bigger, something deeper. As the video continued to gain traction, James knew the battle was far from over. He wasn't just a victim's husband, he was a force, determined to shake the very foundation of the system that allowed this cruelty to thrive. The tension in the air was palpable as James stepped onto the makeshift stage, the crowd before him simmering with anticipation. His heart pounded in his chest, but his voice rang out clear and steady. "This isn't just about Sarah," he began, his words carrying through the charged silence. "It's about what happened to her. But it's also about every single person who's ever felt the crushing weight of injustice." The crowd hung on every word, and James could feel the shift, the ripple of understanding spreading through them. His wife, the woman they had seen attacked so callously, was not just a victim, she was a symbol of everything that was wrong with the system. As James spoke of the pain, the broken trust, and the need for change, the crowd responded, a roar of support rising to the sky. People who had never met Sarah, people who had only watched the video, now stood with them. The energy was electric, a force that could not be ignored. This wasn't just a protest, it was the beginning of a movement, a reckoning that was long overdue. James wasn't asking for justice anymore, he was demanding it. And the city had no choice but to listen. The sun had barely risen the next day, but James was already standing at the front doors of City Hall, his jaw set, his eyes hard with determination. The air felt thick, charged with something that wasn't just the weight of the morning fog. It was the pressure of everything that had been building. Inside, the room was sterile and cold. The bureaucrats seated at their polished tables, their eyes shifting nervously as they saw him walk in. James wasn't here to negotiate, to beg for a semblance of justice. No, this was different. He was here to expose the rot, to force the system to face what it had been hiding for far too long. The mayor, looking tired and unprepared, cleared his throat and opened with the usual script. "We are aware of the incident and we have placed Officer Thompson on administrative leave pending review." The words hung in the air like a slap to the face. Administrative leave. A paid vacation for someone who had shattered his wife's life. James felt the fury rise in him, but he didn't let it show. He raised his hand, cutting through the room like a blade. "Paid administrative leave," he corrected flatly, his voice steady but seething with restrained anger. "He's sitting at home, getting paid by my tax dollars, while my wife lies in that hospital bed, barely able to breathe without pain. And you're telling me that's enough?" The room fell silent, the officials around him shifting uncomfortably in their seats. James was done with polite demands. "I didn't come here for apologies. I didn't come here for your empty words. I came here with evidence," he said, his tone colder now, more threatening. He dropped a thick folder onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet room. Inside that folder were the files they had buried, complaints that had been ignored, internal memos that never saw the light of day, and reports from officers who had tried to call out the abuse but were silenced. "You want to continue pretending that this is just one bad apple?" James continued, his gaze hardening. "Or do you want to finally do something about it?" The mayor opened his mouth, but James wasn't finished. "I want Officer Thompson fired. I want criminal charges filed. And I want every single officer who covered up his actions to be investigated for negligence." He paused, letting his words sink in. The air in the room felt heavier, thicker with tension. James wasn't just demanding justice for Sarah anymore. This was bigger. This was about every single instance of corruption and abuse that had been swept under the rug for years. He wasn't going to back down. "Not now. Not ever. This is simple," he said, his voice like iron. "You do your damn job, or we'll make you do it." The room was still, the silence deafening. They weren't ready for him. Not for this kind of fight. But they heard him, and that was enough. The battle was far from over. And James wasn't about to back down. He had rattled the cage. But now it was time to dig deeper, to unearth the truth buried beneath layers of silence and lies. After his confrontation with the city officials, he knew that the system wasn't going to fold easily. They had their defenses: red tape, bureaucracy, and an unspoken network that protected their own. But James wasn't intimidated. He had something they didn't: the truth, and the relentless drive to see it exposed. James turned to David Cooper, the civil rights attorney, and the two of them began to dig into the history of Officer Thompson and the police department that had let him flourish unchecked. Late nights were spent poring over old case files, looking for anything that might reveal the rot at the heart of the system. They tracked down former colleagues of Thompson who had seen his aggressive behavior but were too afraid to speak up. They found reports of complaints that had been swept under the rug, supervisors who had turned a blind eye, and officers who had quietly agreed to stay silent for the sake of keeping things quiet. It was more than just a personal vendetta, it was a revelation. An entire system built on injustice. And James wasn't going to let them hide behind their badges anymore. He collected evidence, photos, emails, documents, all of it telling the same story: that Officer Thompson wasn't an isolated case. He was the product of an institution that allowed misconduct to flourish, that prioritized its own reputation over the lives of the people it was sworn to protect. The documents were damning, but they needed to be more than just paper evidence. They had to be seen. They had to be felt. James wasn't interested in a quiet investigation or slow-moving bureaucracy. He needed this to explode in the public eye. And he knew how to do it. With David's expertise in the legal field and Lily Evans, an investigative journalist who had been following the case from the beginning, they began strategizing how to bring everything into the light. They organized press briefings, coordinated with local news outlets, and made sure that the story wasn't just another headline, it was a movement. They reached out to the families of other victims who had suffered at the hands of officers like Thompson, making connections, sharing experiences, and amplifying the voices that had been ignored for too long. With every step, the pressure mounted. The public support grew exponentially as more and more people shared the story on social media. It wasn't just a few thousand views now. The video of Sarah's attack had become a rallying cry. It was a call to action. But as the movement gained momentum, so did the resistance. James received more threats, anonymous messages warning him to stop digging, to stop pushing for more, to stop challenging the status quo. He had expected it, even anticipated it, but it didn't shake him. He showed no fear, no hesitation. The deeper he dug, the more he realized how far the corruption spread. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. This was about an entire department, an entire system, that had abused its power for far too long. One evening, after another exhausting round of phone calls and meetings, Lily pulled James aside. Her expression was serious, and her voice lowered as she slid a thick manila envelope across the table. "You need to see this," she said. Inside were new documents, internal memos, handwritten notes from officers who had spoken out against Thompson's behavior but were silenced. There were also emails between department heads discussing how to handle public complaints about Thompson, and suggestions on how to bury the truth. This wasn't just an isolated case, it was a pattern. A system of cover-ups that had allowed officers like Thompson to get away with violent actions time and time again. James's heart sank as he read through the pages. He felt the weight of the corruption pressing down on him. But it only fueled his resolve. This was bigger than him. Bigger than Sarah. Bigger than one man's fight for justice. This was about taking down the entire system that had allowed people like Thompson to thrive. He stood up, his jaw clenched, eyes burning with determination. "We had to go after it all," he said, his voice fierce. "Not just Thompson. The whole damn system." David and Lily nodded, understanding the gravity of what he was saying. The fight wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about dismantling the structures that protected the abusers. It was about exposing the lies that kept the public in the dark. They knew it was going to be dangerous. And it wasn't going to be easy. But James didn't care. He had already come too far to turn back now. The system had failed Sarah. It had failed so many others. And now, James was going to make sure it never happened again. The battle was only beginning. And James was prepared for the war ahead. As the days wore on, James felt the weight of his crusade pressing down on him. The battle he was waging wasn't just against Officer Thompson anymore, it was against the system. The corruption that had rotted the heart of the very institution that was meant to protect the people. Every step forward seemed to bring more resistance, more roadblocks, and more threats. But James was undeterred. He had seen the darkness that lurked behind the badge. And he was ready to expose it, no matter the cost. The media coverage exploded after the release of the evidence. And with it, the public's outrage. Protests began to spread, not just in their city but across the country. People were sick of the same tired excuses, the same empty promises from those in power. They wanted action. They wanted justice. And now, James wasn't just fighting for Sarah anymore. He was fighting for every person who had been wronged. Every person who had felt the weight of systemic oppression. The threats against him became more frequent, more personal. Anonymous calls in the middle of the night. Cryptic notes slipped under his door. And even a chilling warning written on the windshield of his car: "Back down, or we'll bury you in something deeper than paperwork." The message was clear, and the fear it was meant to instill could have crippled anyone else. But not James. He'd faced worse in his past. He had served in a war where the stakes were life and death, where fear was a constant companion. Now, fear had no power over him. It wasn't just his own life at risk anymore. It was the future, the legacy that Sarah and he were fighting to build. He took the threats in stride, never flinching, never showing a crack in his armor. Instead, he used them as fuel. He started meeting with community leaders, Black-owned media outlets, and activist groups that had long been ignored by the mainstream press. Every conversation, every meeting, was an opportunity to amplify the voices that had been silenced for far too long. He spoke directly to the people who had been marginalized, whose stories were buried under the weight of injustice. And he didn't just speak to them, he listened. He learned, and he made their fight his own. James knew the media would try to move on, that the press would eventually find the next big story, the next scandal to chase. But this was different. He wasn't just feeding the flames of a fleeting moment. He was creating a movement that would outlast the headlines. His message wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. About ensuring that what happened to Sarah would never be ignored again. He wasn't seeking revenge, he was demanding responsibility. And so, he pressed on. The protests grew louder, the demands for justice more urgent. The city was on edge. Every public appearance, every rally, every press interview felt like a step closer to breaking the dam of corruption that had held the truth back for so long. But James knew they were still just beginning. The real work had yet to start. Behind closed doors, he and David continued to gather more evidence. They were digging deeper, uncovering more about Officer Thompson's history, about his connections within the department, and the web of silence that had protected him for so long. The more they uncovered, the uglier it got, but with every new revelation, the anger of the people grew stronger. The city was waking up to the truth. The power structures that had kept people like Thompson untouchable were starting to crack. It wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about dismantling the system that allowed abuse to thrive unchecked. James was no longer just fighting for Sarah's justice. He was fighting for a future where everyone could feel safe, where no one had to fear a badge. And with every step, he was moving closer to that future. One that was built on truth, accountability, and the unwavering belief that no one, no matter their power or position, was above the law. He wasn't going to back down. Not now, not ever, and neither would the people who stood with him. The fight was just beginning, and James was ready for the long haul. The day of the trial had arrived, and the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. James stood at the back, his eyes fixed on the judge's bench. As the prosecutor played the harrowing footage for the jury, the grainy video of Sarah, vulnerable and pregnant, being kicked mercilessly by Officer Thompson, filled the room. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The brutal reality of the attack sinking in. But James didn't watch the screen. His focus was on the moment, on the battle that had brought him here. Sarah, bruised and broken, took the stand and recounted the incident in her trembling voice. Her words clear and steady. "I told him I was pregnant. I told him I wasn't causing trouble. But he didn't care." The room went silent. Her pain, her truth, filled the space. It wasn't just a case anymore. It was a reckoning. And James knew, with the weight of the evidence and Sarah's testimony, this wasn't just about holding Thompson accountable. It was about demanding justice for every person who had ever been silenced by abuse of power. As the trial continued, the pressure on the city mounted. The protests outside City Hall were relentless. A constant reminder that the public would not let this injustice slide. The mayor, clearly uncomfortable, sat in closed-door meetings with city officials, scrambling to control the growing storm. James, however, was no longer waiting for answers, he was taking action. Armed with irrefutable evidence, he demanded swift accountability, refusing to let the department hide behind bureaucracy. "We have the receipts," he said, his voice cutting through the hollow responses of those in power. "It's time to stop pretending." The walls that had once protected Officer Thompson were beginning to crumble. And James wasn't backing down until the truth was fully exposed. As the days passed, James and Sarah's fight gained momentum, shifting from a battle for justice to a full-blown movement. The public, once passive, now rallied behind them, their voices rising in unison for change. James wasn't just a victim's husband anymore, he was a symbol of resistance. A man who had ignited a fire too strong to ignore. Their son, Justice, was born amidst the chaos. His name a powerful reminder of what they were fighting for. In the weeks that followed, letters, messages, and stories poured in from people across the nation, all touched by their courage. James and Sarah had turned their pain into purpose, creating a legacy that would outlast them. Their fight wasn't over, but it had already changed everything. The story of James and Sarah Johnson teaches us that when we stand up against injustice, we can spark change. It shows that one person's fight can expose deep corruption, unite a community, and demand accountability from those in power. Their journey reminds us that courage, perseverance, and the unwavering pursuit of truth can break down the walls of silence and oppression. If you believe in the power of justice and the importance of speaking out, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Stay connected for more stories that inspire change and fight for what's right. Together, we can make a difference.